Hi everybody, it's Zena. Hope you're having a good day. I promised that we would have a book review video, so I'm going to film the first one now, and I decided to go ahead and start with the last book that I read, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I know it's a classic, but I don't want to assume that everybody's already read it. You may have seen film adaptations of it. I've seen two, but this was the first time that I've actually read the book. So I decided to go ahead and talk a little bit, not just from the perspective of the reader, but since I'm a writer, I also have a tendency to look at it from the perspective of another writer. But also to note some of the things that I noticed that were distinctly different, at least from the two adaptations that I've seen. I have seen the first one that I saw was the one with Jeremy Brett. The second one that I saw was the one done in the 40s, black and white. It has, if I recall correctly, a very young Angela Lansbury in it, which was very interesting to see. But I have to say, in general, the one with Jeremy Brett was more true to the book in the sense that it took practically every line of dialogue straight out of the book, but it lacked the eeriness of the black and white film. I think the black and white film did a better job in creating the appropriate atmosphere. But in terms of the book, I have to say, even if you've seen a film version of it, regardless of what version it was, regardless of what year it was made, don't think that that negates you reading the book, because it doesn't. I got far more from the book than I got from either of the two films, or both of the two films combined. So I would highly recommend, highly recommend reading the book. I mentioned in my Finally Fall book tag, I mentioned having read this book for the first time just recently. I don't think I mentioned that it was for the first time, but I brought up the fact that Oscar Wilde goes into such finite detail when he's describing every single setting and every single item in the setting. And you would think that that would become redundant. You would think that that might become irritating, but it doesn't. It actually, for me, it in some ways created a slight sense of not just eeriness, but also distrust, which you would think it would cause the opposite. Because you're getting as much information as possible about the setting, so nothing is left to chance, nothing is left to your imagination. You're not questioning your surroundings. But in a funny way, the fact that he's giving you so much information, it becomes too much information, but it's not overwhelming in the sense that you're thinking, okay, fine, great, yeah, shut up already. Could we please get on to the next part of the story? It doesn't make you feel that way at all, or at least it didn't make me feel that way. It made me question, okay, what is he hiding? If he's spending all this time describing the type of curtains that are hanging in the windows, the type of lace that's around somebody's collar, the exact shade of green that is used in a piece of pottery, the exact type of gilding on mirror frame. What is it that he's drawing attention away from? And it also makes you feel like maybe I need to watch my back in this scene, or what's really going to happen in this scene. So another one of the things that was completely left out of both adaptations, I'm pretty sure it was both adaptations. I recently rewatched the Jeremy Brett version. I haven't seen the other one again yet. But one of the things that I notice, of course, if you're going to do a film adaptation of a book, they're going to cut a lot out. They're going to delete characters from the script entirely. They may combine 2 or more characters to create a third that didn't actually exist in the book. There are going to be entire scenes and entire pieces of the plot that will have to be left out, or if they're included at all, they're only given a cursory glance, a cursory explanation, and you don't realize that in the book they play a major role. For instance, for anyone who hasn't read the book, I'm going to try not to give too much away, but one of the pivotal moments is when Dorian Gray writes a note to his, I'm going to put it in quotes, friend, because he's not really the kind of friend I would want, Lord Henry Wotton, or Wotton, I think it's Wooton, I think they pronounce it Wooton, to send him something to read, to lend him a book to read. And the book that Lord Henry, commonly known as Harry, sends to Dorian is a yellow book, a book that is bound in yellow. And you're not told specifically what the book is, but that simple act is what triggers a serious change in the story, later part of the story. And Dorian becomes obsessed with this book. So one of the things that I started thinking about with the influence that Harry has over Dorian, I was considering, because Harry is not really a very good influence, to put it mildly, and because of what eventually ends up happening with Dorian's life, I was asking myself after I finished the book, would Harry have reconsidered his position on certain things if he really realized the influence that he was having? Not to say that Dorian wasn't making his own choices, he was, but would Harry have been as extreme in some of his views if he had really stopped to think about the impact that he was having on this young man? And after some consideration, I had to come, my personal opinion is that no, because unlike the artist, Basil, who paints the picture of Dorian Gray, Harry had every opportunity to see full evidence of what was going on in Dorian's life. He I mean, he did have every opportunity. He had no excuse to not have access to certain information, even if it was just gossip. He had no excuse to not notice that there was a change in Dorian's personality. He had no excuse to not notice the way that certain people reacted to him. He had no excuse to not be aware of the fact that people were saying things that were not exactly healthy in terms of Dorian's reputation. So he had every opportunity to turn around and say, okay, listen, Dorian, there's one thing to not be overly concerned about what people think about you, but when you're talking about things that can assassinate your reputation and make you a permanent social leper, I think we need to have a talk. We need to have a little discussion. But he didn't. So he had every opportunity to have that conversation, and he didn't. If anything, he went right along and continued in the same vein, even though, there were other people, mainly, at least in the story, Basil Hallwood, who were telling him, Hallward, sorry, I'm not entirely sure that you believe what you're saying, but even if you don't, there are some things that cause more harm than good, some ideas that cause more harm than good. And of course, Lord Henry doesn't believe that. So he just says, whatever. And you do get the impression at times, particularly when he's invited out to lunch or he has an audience, in some ways he seems like he wants to perform because he likes the attention. I think that's a good part of it. He likes a certain type of attention, or rather he likes to see the reaction that he can get out of certain people, which is, I think we all, to some extent, at some time, do things just because we want to see a reaction. But most of the time, we temper it with some common sense and a little common decency and a little concern about the other person's feelings. But Lord Henry doesn't necessarily do that. And I can't imagine that he could ever be a truly happy person, which also makes me wonder what would be his definition of happiness, really, outside of all the stuff that he says. And was he always that way? I think if we were looking at him as a real person, I think he definitely probably always sought attention of some form, but I don't think that he would have started out being as extreme in his views. But the fact that even if he didn't want to change his opinions, if he considered himself to be a good friend, even if he didn't think that there was, even if you want to go to an extreme and say, even if he didn't think that there was any truth to the rumors, which in the course of the story you find out that there are all kinds of people all over London who are telling stories about Dorian Gray, and these are not nice stories. Some may be fabricated, some may not be, but the fact that there are so many people who actually know Dorian, who are telling these stories, or even if they're not telling them, they start out as friends and then suddenly they don't want to have anything to do with them. Dorian Gray walks into the room, other people walk out, quite literally. Or if they pass him on the street, they kind of lean away and look over their shoulder as he passes by. Some people will even cross the street. There's a part in the book where it says some people won't even walk on the same side of the street that Dorian Gray walks on. And, of course, when Basil hears about it, finally, because you get the impression that for part of the time, Basil, being an artist, he's involved in his work, he's traveling, he's not that in tune with what is being said in town. And when he finds out about it, he's really the only one who has any concern about what's being said. Whereas Harry, who's supposed to be Dorian's so-called best friend, doesn't show any concern at all. And then also another difference is that Lord Henry sees that Dorian isn't aging. He spends years around him. He sees he's not aging. And instead of, there's a scene in the book where he asks Dorian to tell him his secret. And Dorian won't. And Lord Henry's reaction is, what a pity, which is very telling. That's very telling, if you ask me, because he has no excuse to not realize that there's something not right. So, also, Dorian ends up, at least he believes, falling in love with an actress. And a stage actress, of course, because motion pictures were not around at the time. And I think, I always question, was he actually in love with her? Because first of all, he didn't know her. He'd seen her only on stage. He had gone backstage before, but he hadn't told her his name, which, is it necessarily an indicator that is that necessarily dubious? Did he have dubious intent when he didn't tell her his name? I think you could make a case both ways, because at that time there were people who may have been gossiping about him to some extent, but it wasn't anywhere near what it eventually became. The talk was not anywhere near as concerning or as widespread as it later became. But I do think he genuinely thought that he was in love with her, especially since he said he intended to marry her, which is a big decision to make. And yes, he could have made it lightly, but he says that he had a desire to be good. So he knows, contrary to what perhaps some people might think, he does have a conscience. There are several indicators all throughout the book that he does have a conscience. He knows that what he's doing isn't right. But I think in terms of actually being in love, I think that was more, I think she was probably, if I had to guess, the genuine love was more on her side early on than on his. I think probably for her it was love at first sight. I'm not entirely sure if it was for him, but obviously he was attracted to her for a reason, and I don't think that that would have happened if they hadn't been meant to at least be together in some way, because she would have been a far more positive influence on him, probably one of the most positive influences on him, even if they didn't get married, or even if the romance didn't last. I think that she would have caused him to question some of the things that he was believing, some of the beliefs he had adopted. And you do see that when he announces that he has an interest in this actress, that he's fallen in love with her, that, I mean, even though he describes her only in terms of the characters that she's playing, I do think that just her personality, her way of being when he saw her backstage when she was not in character, I think that that perhaps was enough to at least make him curious about certain things and make him question the ideals that he had adopted and whether or not they were really as harmless as some people, like Lord Henry, thought. And if morality really was as old-fashioned an ideal as Lord Henry seems to believe. So I would definitely read the book, regardless of whether you think, oh, I've seen the movie, I don't need to read the book. No, you get a lot more from reading the book. Also, I have to say that I was surprised at, I'm not saying that it's a really long book, but it's longer than I expected it to be. Because sometimes, you know, if I'm watching a movie and I know that it's based on a book, sometimes maybe a little unconsciously, I have a tendency to imagine, okay, this book based on the movie is probably so long, so many pages long. It's probably a short story, or it's probably just a story, probably not a novel or a novella. It's probably relatively short. And I'm not going to say that this is an extremely long book. It's what, 10, 15, 19, I think it's either 19 or 20 chapters. I forget now. I think it's 20. And yeah, 20. But I wasn't expecting it to be quite this long. I've read The Importance of Being Earnest. I've read that. And that was about as long as I expected it to be. But The Picture of Dorian Gray was significantly longer. Also, you have scenes which didn't appear in the adaptation that I saw, where Dorian goes to certain, since this is going to be on YouTube, I suppose I have to be careful with what I say. He goes to certain places that are frequented by people who, particularly in that time, enjoyed the recreational use of certain substances, if you get my drift. Particularly substances that came from a certain very pretty flower. You didn't see that in the adaptation that I saw. It's been a while since I've seen the 1940s film. I do intend to rewatch it at some point. I don't remember if there was any hint in that one, but there definitely wasn't in the Jeremy Brett version. But I would highly recommend that, regardless of whether you're all that into classics, I can understand it, but I decided, hey, if they've done film versions of this book so many times, the least I can do is actually read the original book, even if it's just to see what was left out. And I'm really glad I did. I think that in many ways it just felt like I was reading a newspaper of some of the stuff that people are saying today, in terms of the falling away from morality. Your actions don't really have any consequences, and all that stuff. All the stuff that living life kind of proves isn't right, isn't true. So, The Picture of Dorian Gray, this is definitely one that I'm glad that I got. I picked this copy up from Barnes & Noble. Not the last time that I went, but maybe 5 months ago, 4 months ago, something like that. Because I actually haven't gone to Barnes & Noble very much in quite a while. But I'm glad that I got this one. So this is my first book review video attempt. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to be doing several of these, quite a few of them. I already have 2 other books that I'm going to review. Not sure when I'm going to film the review for the next book. I'm almost done with it. I might be able to film it tomorrow, but we'll see. So I hope you enjoyed it. Go ahead and like, subscribe, share the video if you like, and happy reading. Bye.